All right, so good morning, everyone, or good evening if you're calling in from Southeast Asia. I see that our attendees are coming in from the waiting room, so we're going to give people about a minute to connect before we move into the content for today's discussion on climate change in the Philippines. So while everyone is joining the call, I'm just going to give a very brief logistical remark. So we do have a full panel discussion today, and I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, William Weiss, shortly to run through that discussion with our expert panelists and speakers. But before we do, I just want to note that we will be doing an open audience question and answer session at the end of the discussion today. So during the conversation, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A box that's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I think most of us are very familiar with this, but I will be watching the questions as they come in throughout the discussion and bringing them together verbally to ask to our panel at the end. So please do ask questions throughout. Please introduce yourself in your question if you want to be asked or referenced by name or organization, and please direct your question to a specific panelist or panelists when you ask it so that we can make sure we get you the answer you're looking for. So with that said, Bill, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you because we've already got a good crowd in the room, but we're delighted to welcome everyone to today's discussion with the Stimson Center and the U.S.-Philippine Society, and I'll let Bill take it from here.
Thanks, Courtney, and good morning, everyone on the U.S. East Coast. Good evening to our audience in Southeast Asia. Wherever you are, we're glad that you could join us for this Philippines Roundtable event on climate change in the Philippines. We're hosted by the Southeast Asia Forum at the Stimson Center. My name is Bill Wise. I chair the Southeast Asia Forum. The forum's mission is to promote the study of Southeast Asia at colleges, universities, and research institutions in the mid-Atlantic area of the US. But our scope is much broader and deeper. We're here to encourage and assist organizations, student groups, individuals in academia, government, NGOs, and the private sector who are engaged with Southeast Asia. This is our first Southeast Asia Forum seminar for 2022, and the third in our series of events looking at climate change in Southeast Asia. You can find recordings of previous Southeast Asia Forum seminars and information about forum activities on our web pages at the Stimson Center website. One important note for today: this seminar is being recorded and is on the record. We have two sponsors for our Philippines Roundtable today, both of whom are designated partners of the Southeast Asia Forum: the U.S.-Philippine Society and the Southeast Asia League of Students at Johns Hopkins SAIS. We invite academic programs at U.S. and foreign universities, as well as student organizations interested in Southeast Asia, to become partners of the Southeast Asia Forum. Please contact us if you are interested. I'd also like to express our gratitude to Henry Howard, member of our Southeast Asia Forum Advisory Council, and two anonymous donors for providing the seed money for these seminars. In a moment, I will introduce Philippine Ambassador Jose Manuel Ramaldas to make remarks on behalf of the Republic of the Philippines. Following the ambassador's remarks, I'll introduce our three distinguished panelists and pose some moderators' questions to them. I hope the panelists will engage in a free-flowing discussion of the topics raised by these questions. At about 9:45 Eastern Time, my Stimson colleague, Courtney Weatherby, will bring audience questions to the panel. You can put a question into the queue simply by entering them in the Q&A box. So let's begin right now. Ambassador Jose Manuel Romualdez has been at his diplomatic post in Washington for several years, and his consequence is very well known in our city and across this country. He's a journalist and businessman by profession, a strong advocate for his country, a vigorous proponent of Philippine-American relations, and, I should add, a great supporter of the Southeast Asia Forum. Ambassador Ramaldas, welcome back to the Philippines Roundtable. We are looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Bill, and good morning to everyone in Manila or here, and good evening to people in Manila. Let me thank once again the U.S.-Philippine Society and the Stimson Center Southeast Asia Forum, particularly the USPS President Ambassador John Maisto, Executive Director Hank Henriksen, and Southeast Asia Forum Chair Bill Wise, of course, for organizing this virtual forum on climate change with particular focus on the Philippines. I also wish to thank our distinguished panelists, Mr. Craig Hart, Deputy Assistant Administrator for East Asia and the Pacific of USAID, Ms. Maria Antonia Tony Loisaga, Yulo Loisaga, President of the National Resilience Council, Mr. Butch Maley, President of the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation, for participating in this forum. The discussions today will no doubt further amplify the Philippines' call for action as far as our climate vulnerability is concerned. Climate change has not only made typhoons more destructive and more frequent in the Philippines, but also affected our lands, seas, affecting vulnerable communities and our natural resources. What is appalling is that the Philippines, as one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, bears the brunt of consequences of the climate change while only accounting for 0.0 or 0.3% of the total global emissions. Despite the challenges we face, the Philippines is determined to proactively undertake climate action, working together with the rest of our partners in addressing climate change. The Philippines recently submitted its nationally determined contribution, or the NDC, which aims to achieve 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, setting a bold example to the rest of the world for this ambitious goal. To hasten our action against the consequences of climate change, the Philippines has now shifted from theories and pronouncements on climate change to concrete adaptation and mitigation programs. Some of our initiatives include putting together Filipino experts to engage with our climate vulnerable communities to prepare and implement localized plans, encouraging private and public investments in green projects, pushing for legislation to ban or regulate single-use plastics, and transitioning from coal to clean energy. The Philippines is also working under the Asean framework in collecting or pursuing climate adaptation and mitigation actions under the region's commitment to the Paris Agreement. As we pursue climate change together, we would also like to reiterate our call for climate justice, that the wealthier countries, which have contributed the most part of the greenhouse gas emissions, accept the responsibility and assist developing and vulnerable countries in adapting to climate change. This reaffirms the Philippines' commitment to common but differentiated and respective capabilities. We therefore call for more climate finance that is demand-driven and responsive to the needs of developing countries. At the COP26 in Glasgow, the Philippines participated with high-level representation with no less than Foreign Affairs Secretary Teodoro Locsin Jr. and Finance Secretary Carlos Dominguez attending the meetings to push for our objectives. In his statement at the high-level segment, Secretary Locsin stressed the need for those with greater capacity to help countries with less, even as they are suffering from most of the brunt of climate change. To this end, he urged the agreement on the Paris Rulebook, which will make the Paris Agreement fully operational. The Philippines welcomes the Biden administration's renewed and aggressive campaign for collective related action, and we do hope to work with the United States and other nations in solutions to finally address climate issues and allowing us for to meet our targets for 2030. We note the recent ministerial meeting of the Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate, chaired by Special President Envoy for Climate John Kerry, and hope that future discussions will likewise involve the participation of the most vulnerable nations, including the Philippines, which has been hit by disasters upon disasters every year. I am an environmentalist by heart and would like to see the impetus of global action on climate change to be sustained for years to come. In my letter to Secretary Kerry, I put forth my recommendation for the United States to further take the lead in ensuring that there will be a consistent follow-up to commitments made by nations during the COP26 through regular regional meetings that will take stock of their respective implementation. These regional meetings will be intersessional and will feed into the annual COP meetings as to the more formal enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement that will require nations to report on actions taken stating in 2024 or starting 2024. At the bilateral level, the Philippines and the United States have committed to work together to establish concrete and significant collaborations on climate change. During the recently concluded 9th Philippines-US bilateral strategic dialogue, we agreed to work closely together on science and technology cooperation to address climate change. In addition, we agreed to cooperate on clean energy, including nuclear energy, as a means for the Philippines to transition away from fossil fuels. As the US ramps up its production for renewable energy products, the Philippines aims to participate in the supply chain for renewable energy and consequently help the country also transition to its clean energy mix. The Philippines, like so many other developing and vulnerable countries, including the Asean, will require the continued assistance of developed countries such as the United States in achieving its climate goals. We have, for instance, greatly benefited from the USAID's programs and initiatives in building resilience capabilities in the Philippines to significantly reduce casualties and damages brought about by climate change through its collaboration with the national and local governments, local communities, and organizations. Moving forward, increasing our engagements in renewable energy, climate-friendly infrastructures, supply chain for clean energy, and enhancing climate or climate finance access will go a long way, not only in reaching our respective commitments, but also in achieving our global commitment and objective to fight the effects of climate change and building resilient communities. With that, thank you very much to all of you, and I look forward to your discussions.
Thank you, Ambassador. We greatly appreciate your remarks and particularly your observations about the role in international climate change affairs that the Philippines is playing. Before I introduce our panel, I want to take just a moment here to recognize the passing of Ambassador Roberto Romulov last week and to offer condolences to his family on behalf of the Southeast Asia Forum and our Philippines Roundtable, U.S.-Philippine Society, and SEALs. Ambassador Romulov was a leader in national, regional, and international affairs and a true champion of Philippine-U.S. relations. He was also a tireless advocate for a strong response to climate and disaster risk and for resilience building in the Philippines. He will be greatly missed, not only in the Philippines, but across the region and in the U.S. as well. Our panelists today, first, Antonia Loizaga is president of the National Resilience Council in the Philippines, a public-private partnership that supports government, communities, academia, and the private sector in promoting national resilience through climate and disaster risk reduction. Welcome to the Southeast Asia Forum, Tony. Happy to have you here. Renee Butch-Miley is president of the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation, an alliance of businesses in the Philippines involved in building the disaster risk management capabilities of the private sector in the country and assisting government and communities in preparing for and responding to disasters. I visited the PDRF's impressive Emergency Operations Center where the organization conducts disaster response training and coordinates recovery and rehabilitation. And with the recent problems in the Philippines, they have been very busy. Good to have you back again at the Philippines Roundtable. Butch.
Thanks, Bill. It's good to be here.
Craig Hart is Deputy Assistant Administrator for East Asia and Pacific at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Prior to assuming his current position 18 months ago, he was Deputy Mission Director in Vietnam from 2016 to 2020. He's a career member of the USAID Senior Foreign Service. It's an honor to have you with us today, Craig. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bill. Great to be here.
And I also want to recognize and welcome our partner at the U.S.-Philippines Society, its Executive Director, Hank Hendrickson. Thank you very much for your help in organizing this event, Hank, and we're delighted to work with you again.
Great partnership.
It is indeed. Let's turn first to Antonia Loizaga. President of the National Resilience Council. Tony, before I ask you a question, I mentioned a moment ago that Ambassador Romulo had a lifelong interest in building a strong climate and disaster risk response in the Philippines. Could you share with us your thoughts on how Ambassador Romulo's ideas help shape your organization and its mission?
Thank you very much, Bill, and good evening to all. I think most of you who know Ambassador Romulo know that he was a powerful and energetic and inspiring personality. And he was very keen to actually see the country step out of the vulnerable position that it is in terms of climate change and other hazards as well. But let me say that Ambassador Romulo convened the National Resilience Council. It was his idea to actually first have business identify climate change as a non-traditional security threat to development. And that he articulated very well. That gave the NRC a risk horizon to look at and a systems lens that considered the plausible and not just the possible, because we have had extensive experience over time of various disasters. Secondly, he advocated evidence-informed whole-of-society approaches to climate and disaster resilience. And that really defined new roles for government and the private sector in working together as far as investing in prevention, rather than just in response and relief capacity. The third way he actually inspired our work is really supporting the engagement of local and international networks of experts, practitioners included, and advocating the use of digital technologies for disaster risk reduction, space-based technologies that produce satellite imagery, for example, actually adopting IoT and analytics and risk assessment and communication. And the last two, I think, very clear, would be his focus on building capacity at the local level, where risk starts. And that means engaging local governments where exposure and vulnerability are differentiated and continue to change dynamically. And lastly, in relation to that, moving science to policy and action by engaging academia, civil society organizations, communities themselves in adopting a resilience framework and using metrics to track the progress of each local community. Innovative approaches, they're not, I would say, very sexy in their approach to actually building resilience, because there are no photo ops in building capacity. But certainly Ambassador Romulo was not interested in those. He was basically interested in making sure that locally people are able to cope, not just survive, but thrive in the face of risk. Thank you, Bill.
Well, thank you very much for that really important background, Tony. Now, could you please give us a picture of climate and disaster risk in the Philippines? Risk being a product of hazard exposure and vulnerability. What are the elements of risk that put the Philippines near the top of the list of countries threatened by the effects of climate change and by natural disasters?
Thank you, Bill. And I'll start with citing a figure from the Department of Finance. Over the decade 2010 to 2020, 98% of the total loss and damage that they have recorded at the DOF due to climate and weather-related disasters. That's actually about 0.5% of annual GDP lost every year, basically from climate and weather events. The interesting thing about climate change, and as you have said, risk, the intersection of H, E, and V, is that these are social and physical geographies that need to be understood. They are complex, they're dynamic. Hazards-wise, we all know tropical cyclones, floods, rainfall-induced landslides, droughts, storm surges, sea level rise higher than the global average, combined with subsidence in some areas, particularly urban areas. Looking forward for the Philippines, in general, hotter, drier, fewer but more intense tropical cyclones, higher sea surface temperatures. And this is where we really have to take note. Daytime and nighttime temperatures will continue to increase, with the average increase of about 1.1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius by mid-century. That's the moderate RCP 4.5. If we go to the high-risk RCP 8.5 scenario, you're looking at temperatures between 1.4 and 3 degrees by the end of the 20th century. And that's something that we really need to be concerned about. Average rainfall overall will be decreasing. And some areas, though, in the northwest of Luzon may actually be a little wetter. So again, these are various impacts of climate change. Because a warmer atmosphere holds more water, we expect actually that will come from surfaces, including the sea. And in fact, rainfall in some areas would actually be quite extreme. Tropical cyclones, interestingly, are projected to either be the same in count or slightly decrease, but as I've said, more intense. And that's the number that make landfall that we should actually be concerned about and where that we need to anticipate. Overall, geographically, Mindanao will be the most affected by future increase in temperatures and decrease in rainfall. And that's a matter of concern. Exposure-wise, ecosystems, human settlements, critical infrastructure, supply and value chains, all are exposed to this differentiated impacts of climate change in terms of the hazard, changing the temperature and rainfall. Vulnerability-wise, organizational vulnerability, the need for capacity in adapting risk governments, that needs to be actually highlighted. Local leadership and governance, we need to keep away from siloed bureaucracies, which are in fact the case by and large. Vulnerable populations. COVID has pushed our poverty incidence up to 23.7. Poverty in rural and urban areas are different. They're differently abled women, children, indigenous communities, and communities that have a history of conflict and violence. Ecological vulnerability, degraded environments, we all know these. Small islands, aging and fragile infrastructure, the agricultural, fisheries, and forestry sectors really need attention. Unregistered MSMEs and nano enterprises also need special attention. Finally, our early warning systems need to be protected. We need the early warning in order to anticipate these different disasters. Final word about climate change and natural technological disasters. As we've seen in the context of compound, cascading, and systemic risk. We've just had a super typhoon in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic, the failure of communications, failure of power systems, and failure of water infrastructure. That's the sort of future that we actually are going to be facing if we don't understand the intersectionality of these vulnerabilities in terms of climate change-related hazards. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you very much, Tony. Butch Miley, why is the private sector central to the Philippines' response to climate change and its effects? And more specifically, what special advantages does the private sector bring to the table? What special capabilities does the private sector have to influence policymaking on climate change and to identify measures to mitigate its effects?
Thanks, Bill. The private sector really drives industrialization and infrastructure, and many of the big utilities and lifeline industries are part of the private sector, whether it's water, power, fuel, roads, that's all owned by the different private companies. So it's really important for these companies to be on board in terms of dealing with climate change. Other thing is the private sector can move quickly, and where business leads, others are going to follow. If there's more investment and jobs in the green economy, there's a multiplier effect on both the national economy and on the perceptions of people about climate change. One more thing about the private sector is that it spurs innovation. There are several startups involved in aspects of climate change today, whether it's recycling, e-tricycles, loans to farmers. There's even a startup called Comunidad, Komunidad, that empowers climate-smart businesses and communities. Not sure about their business model. At PDRF, we've learned from the Super Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. It's one of the strongest storms ever to make land. And that's when we built the world's only national operations center run by the private sector. From there, we can monitor storms anywhere in the world, and we've been making more use of geospatial mapping technologies, both pre-disaster and post-disaster, to highlight vulnerable areas. So the private sector has a role to play, both in mitigation and climate change adaptation.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Butch. Craig Hart, the U.S. and the Philippines have partnered on climate change issues for many years. Bring us up to date on the state of this important partnership, and more directly, what is USAID's role in helping the Philippines respond to climate change and its effects? That is, what tools do you employ on your side of the partnership, and what have you achieved as a consequence?
Bill, thank you very much for the question. And I want to thank U.S.-Philippine Society, the Stimson Center, Ambassador Ramaldas, and our distinguished panelists here for engaging and partnering with USAID and having us here today for this great conversation. I was also very sad to hear of the recent passing of Foreign Secretary Romulov, who will be remembered very much for his long record of committed service to the people of the Philippines. I love what Tony said in terms of the contributions that he has made to this extremely important topic. We at USAID will definitely be remembering his vital role that he played in terms of supporting the strong relationship between the US and the Philippines. I also want to take a second to remember and provide my condolences to the lives lost and harmed by Typhoon Ai, or Typhoon Odette as it's known locally. The US and USAID stand strong with our Filipino friends, partners, and allies in terms of helping support communities devastated by the typhoon. And I want to acknowledge the fact that the government's preemptive evacuations, the early warning systems, and the pre-positioning of relief supplies undoubtedly saved lives. And it's this group that has a lot to do with all of those aspects. So thank you. In terms of your question, the devastation wrought by the typhoon underscores really why climate change must remain a key priority. And so as we speak, USAID is finalizing our new climate strategy to ramp up climate change mitigation and adaptation in all of our partner countries, including the Philippines. In the November 2021 Joint Vision for a 21st Century US-Philippines Partnership, both the US and Philippines governments recognize the existential threat that climate crisis poses to the world today, and the critical need for all of our countries to act on climate mitigation and adaptation with urgency, underline urgency. In terms of mitigation, we know that one, meeting this crisis head on is going to be able to help save lives. We also know that tackling the climate crisis in the Philippines is smart from an economic standpoint, as Butch just mentioned. For 60 years, USAID has partnered with the Filipino people, and as the Philippines adapts to the consequences of climate change, including and worsening natural disasters. So together, we've made some great strides. I'll highlight a couple really quick. USAID and the Philippine Department of Environment and Natural Resources teamed up on a new digital technology innovations systems, such as the Lawan Forest Monitoring Tool. This has improved the management of over 90% of the forests in the Philippines. And in turn, reforestation and forest conservation contributed to reducing 10 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. So what does that mean? It's approximately likening it to 2 million cars off the streets for about a year. Between 2014 and 2019, USAID mobilized $579 million in the investments for the Philippines' renewable energy development, which resulted in an additional 240 megawatts of energy from renewable sources and increasing energy security. So our shared successes are sparking economic growth and increased prosperity sustainably, which is critical. In terms of the resilience and disaster response, Philippines has definitely been on the front lines of climate change for years. We know that. USAID works year-round to help communities in the Philippines prepare for natural disasters and provides humanitarian assistance in times of crisis. A couple of quick examples. Super Typhoon Ai, or Odette, USAID is providing $20 million in humanitarian assistance to help those affected. So let me make that more concrete in terms of what that really means. USAID partners are actually providing food assistance, water, sanitation, and hygiene services, shelter assistance to meet emergency needs and help affected communities start rebuilding homes, livelihood support to help restart local markets, and protection for the most vulnerable people affected by the storm. In addition, USAID partners are supporting the government of the Philippines-led response in terms of logistics, emergency telecommunications, and coordination assistance. Also, since 2010, USAID has provided more than $325 million in disaster relief and recovery aid, and strengthened the disaster risk reduction capacity of over 100 cities and municipalities in the Philippines. This includes supporting the government of the Philippines' response to Typhoon Haiyan, or Yolanda as it's known locally, one of the most powerful tropical cyclones ever recorded. This funding helped build climate-resilient schools and health clinics, rekindle the economy, and strengthen the government's disaster risk reduction efforts. So these are just a few of the examples of how USAID is very proud to be partnering with the folks on this screen and many others to be able to assist on the ground when needed, strengthening climate resilience and reducing the risks brought on by natural disasters. Thank you.
And thank you, Craig. One more question. You've painted a very interesting picture of current activity and successes, but this is a problem that's going to be with us into the considerable future, no doubt. Exactly how is USAID's future plans, how do they work into the kind of future problems that Tony in particular has mentioned? And more to the point, are there obstacles, or since I guess there are always obstacles, what particularly are the obstacles that affect the agency's ability to realize its plans for working with the Philippines?
Great, thanks, Bill. So since we've been in the Philippines and have been partnering with the Philippines for 60 years, we've got a lot to build on. And so we take full advantage of that. Let me tell you about a couple of activities that are going to be coming online here. One is the Climate Resilient Cities, which is a 5-year, up to $15 million project that's going to help cities adapt to, mitigate, and endure the impacts of climate change by increasing their access to climate financing, which is critical, as we know, and the tools to build resilience. So it's going to be working in 6 climate vulnerable cities with the estimated combined total population of 2.3 million. Through this new project, USAID is going to be continuing to help cities update their land use plans, which Tony mentioned, which identify what green projects they are going to be prioritizing and what criteria is going to be utilized for that. USAID is going to support the cities to access climate funds to support these projects, such as through the People's Survival Fund. This builds on our joint effort with the national government to ensure that local land use plans take climate risks and hazards into account. The second one I'll mention really quick is Energy Secure Philippines, which is a 5-year project up to $34 million to support key energy sector priorities and climate mitigation goals per the Philippines nationally determined contribution that the ambassador referenced. USAID will work with Philippine government and private sector partners on different aspects of energy security, including enhancing healthy competition in the power sector. So this project aims to mobilize $750 million in private sector investments, which is exactly what Butch was talking about, the critical aspect of private sector investments. And it's going to be helping to develop at least 500 megawatts of clean energy generation, which would prevent 90 billion pounds of coal from being burned. The project is now supporting the Philippines to conduct their first ever renewable energy auctions, which will lead to a new cost-effective clean energy projects. So the project builds basically on previous areas of collaboration, which is, I think, one of the most effective ways to work, and such as the energy virtual one-stop shop that we had collaboration on as well. In terms of challenges, let me mention a couple of things really quick. And that is for adaptation programming, I think that partners are strained by the sheer size and geographic spread of the Philippines. It's one of the most vulnerable in terms of climate risks and frequent extreme weather events, as has been noted. But I also believe that partnering with local organizations, including those represented here by my fellow panelists, are going to allow us to be more effective and assist more communities. So that's one. The second one, really quick, is in terms of climate mitigation, the reliance on coal is huge. and has been noted already today. At the same time, we are very encouraged by the ambitious targets that the Philippines National Determined Contribution has noted by the ambassador, 75% by 2030. And mobilizing finance for these targets is going to be really critical. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Bill.
Bill, let me just chime in real quickly.
Yes, please.
To Craig's point about partnerships. We're part of that Climate Resilient Cities initiative, and it just started. And we have high hopes for it. We've got the whole team behind it. So I want to thank USAID for starting it. There's also another project that USAID is involved in called the Philippine Water Challenge. And we were partners there as well, in which the idea was to ask for innovations to solve the different water issues that the Philippines faces. And the local water companies, Maynilad and Manila Water, joined this as well. So it was a nice example of all these different partners getting together for the greater good. So thanks, Craig, for all that help.
Butch, thank you for your partnership.
Tony, did you want to add something?
Yes, thank you, Bill. Thanks, Craig and Butch, for this really interesting inputs. I'd really like to just chime in on the part of being demand-driven and what we've learned from being on the ground locally. And what we're seeing is a real lack of an ecosystem that is science and technology-based that will deal with adaptation and disaster risk reduction challenges due to climate change. And that really speaks to the need for a greater investment in collaboration, science and technology, both basic and applied research, as well as building the kind of infrastructure around those economic hubs that will actually represent the support needed for the radiation out to the other communities that are in fact linked to those hubs by either supply chains or by social infrastructures. And I think that that's possibly where a little bit more groundwork can be done, and we're happy to chime in and help with that as well. We will be starting a resilience project with the Australian government as well, I should add that, and this is provinces, as well as the Bangsamoro region. And so we're hoping to work together very closely with you, Butch, and see how we can integrate some of the work and align some of the work we're doing in provinces and the special needs as well. Thanks.
Switching gears just a bit, Tony, the 2021 survey of elite views in Southeast Asia, conducted by Singapore's highly respected Institute for Southeast Asia Studies, found the Philippines with the highest percentage of respondents among all ASEAN states viewing climate change as serious and immediate threat to the well-being of the country. Public opinion polling in the Philippines consistently suggests that ordinary Filipinos are also deeply concerned about climate change. How does this unusually strong elite and public support affect policymaking on climate change? Where, and I mean, on what issues in particular is public opinion most influential? And is there a downside to a highly, deeply interested and motivated public opinion on this subject?
Thanks, Bill. That's kind of a loaded question. So I'll start
terribly
with,
loaded. Yes.
I'll start with the issue on how strong public support affect policy making. Certainly, there's been a lot of noise in the media and as well from sectoral groups in order to enhance transparency on the part, for example, of the private sector in how it actually is beginning to address the impacts of their own operations on the vulnerability of populations as well as the environment. And here's where, we're hoping that the push towards disclosures, ESG in sustainability reporting can actually address the need for that transparency. And that's being helped a lot by the national government as well in creating the kind of environment that would support these types of disclosures, in terms of how, for example, corporations are investing not just in emissions reduction, energy source transitioning and efficiency, waste and pollution management, but also in beyond the fence line issues that include community vulnerability, the impact on ecosystems. And Butch mentioned the use of space-based technologies and imagery pre and post disaster, possibly the adoption of spatial finance approaches to ESG that will help the transparency and the communication between the private sector and the larger public on how the businesses are actually contributing to adaptation and mitigation, and not just to, in fact, increasing exposure and vulnerability. I'll say this in terms of the larger, I would say, broader public, in terms of what is of concern to them, and therefore where pressure is actually being placed on policymaking. Where loss and damage are greatest are in the most vulnerable and exposed populations. And that's what actually is putting pressure on the government, for example, regarding the debate for the creation of the Department of Disaster Resilience that would in fact take this function away from the Department of National Defense and have it as a standalone policy and implementation department, not just waiting for disaster to happen, but take proactive measures in terms of designing socio-economic environmental programs that address the intersecting threats to food, water, health, livelihood, security. I think that that's where the prevention and preparedness agenda, the land use, ecosystem, and environment protection agenda really will find its place. And so that debate goes on. There are several bills waiting now in Congress, and there are different interest groups, of course, expressing their support for the various, I should say, versions of the bill. At the end of the day, I think those politically sensitive issues, housing, livelihood, health now, because in fact of COVID, and food and water security are those issues which will be brought to bear against most policy and decision makers in the country. And that's where I think we should be watching and helping to develop the kind of policies that in fact will address not just the immediate, but the long-term impacts of climate change and other hazards. So I hope that answers, at least in part, your.
It does, and I simply wanted to highlight the fact that the Philippines stands out among all the 10 ASEAN states as overwhelmingly the most concerned with climate change and its effects. So that has both political as well as other implications, and I appreciate very much your answer. Also, digging a little deeper on a subject we've previously addressed, the Philippines' heavy dependency on coal for electricity generation. This dependency on coal is not unusual in the Philippines. Many countries have the same experience, but it does present a dilemma for the private sector. Economic and business development needs often conflict, as we know, with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in order to combat climate change. The Philippines, as I said, is not unique, but it is an extant dilemma. What can the Philippines private sector do to resolve the conflicting demands of economic growth and climate and disaster risk reduction? Where is the space that the private sector can occupy here? And perhaps you can add, and how does that work with the government's interests?
Well, Bill, that is certainly the core of the problem, the development environment nexus. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the Philippines faced an energy crisis when Indonesia banned all coal exports as part of their commitment to reduce carbon emissions. The government had to appeal to Indonesia to suspend the ban so that we could keep a lot of our plants going. But fortunately, technologies come to the rescue, and the cost of using renewable energy has come down dramatically over the past few years. Recent studies have shown that like 2/3 of the wind and solar projects that came on stream globally in 2020 will be able to generate cheaper electricity than even the world's newest and cheapest coal plants. Solar, in particular, is much more affordable and easier to use. And renewable energy today, more than ever, presents an attractive economic alternative to the use of fossil fuels. In fact, there's a number of companies that have started going in that direction. Energy Development Corporation, EDC, focuses solely on renewable energy, mainly geothermal. Ayala Energy sold its coal plants and is focusing on renewable energy as well. Ayala Corporation launched what they call the Road to Net Zero. They are currently, believe it or not, 91% carbon neutral in all of its malls and other offices and operations. So companies are beginning to change facilities to emit less carbon. But in the future, I think it's really important to integrate these environmental considerations in any of the growth-oriented projects that we go into. So I think it goes in hand with what the government is trying to do to move in that direction. But it's not always an easy thing.
Indeed, it's not. But it's good to know that you and the private sector are working in this direction. Craig Hart, how does USAID's work in the Philippines fit into the broader fabric of activities of your agency in Southeast Asia more generally, and with U.S. climate change policy in the region and beyond?
Wonderful. Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. I think as we look at ASEAN, and ASEAN hasn't gotten a lot of airtime for our conversation here as well, but probably should, because we are, as of this past October, the White House came out with a $102 million commitment in terms of new activities for ASEAN to support ASEAN countries and the ASEAN Secretariat. And so we are looking at the Southeast Asia region as a wonderfully unique place to tackle some of these challenges, exactly for the reasons that Butch has put forward, exactly because of the private sector component of this, and making sure that we have private sector investments and that we look at the challenges that are in front of us, which are significant, with our partners, not just private sectors, also NGOs, also university think tanks. One of the areas that we just mentioned just now is in terms of energy. And so we've worked in the Philippines specifically in terms of standing up an energy institute that really taps on the best and brightest students to be able to tackle this issue together with us, to develop that new generation of how we're going to come together as a team, truly a team. And I think this panel really represents just that. A team of folks from different perspectives coming together to tackle an issue, and each one of those inputs are extremely necessary to moving us off the mark. And I think that is the same when we look at ASEAN as a whole, and the member states that can come together and set the standards that are required, encourage each other in terms of locally grown solutions, which I think are extremely important. And one of the things that USAID very much relies on is that locally generated solution set and locally generated definition of what the issues are in the first place. And I think that combination is the right combination of partnering. And also, as was mentioned earlier, I think maybe Tony mentioned this, the Australians and other development partners are very much a part of this scene. And that's going to be a necessary partnership as well. We're working with South Korea, we're working with the Japanese, Australia, and others as we pull in different partners to come together and understand where the commonalities are, where we can integrate their private sector, our private sector, different approaches on that, as well as NGOs, universities, et cetera. So I think the panel that you've pulled together today is really the emphasis, is how do we each come at this in a way that recognizes the severity of the issue, and we each provide a piece of the solution set. Thanks.
Good, very well put. Thank you, Craig, for that observation. Now let's go right to our audience questions. We have quite a few already in the queue. Courtney, please help us through the questions and see what how our panelists can respond.
Indeed, and I do want to thank everyone and ask you that you do please continue to submit the questions. We may not get to all of them, but I'll try to combine some of them so that we can answer the substance of what everyone is asking. So I'll start with sort of a first broad planning question that's primarily addressed to Tony, which is that the Philippine National Climate Change Action Plan recognizes that local communities face differentiated climate risks and vulnerabilities. And you touched on this earlier, but could you speak a little bit more about how the National Resilience Council and other actors are working to understand and respond to very specific localized needs for adaptation and protection, given that different communities need different assistance types?
Thanks, Courtney, and thanks for that question. The National Resilience Council actually has a Resilient Local Government Unit program. It's a 3-year, 2-track program that actually has tracks on leadership and governance in science and technology, combined in 3 years, prepare, adapt, and transform years. What we do is we do a deep dive with local governments and work with them on their generating their own climate and disaster risk assessments. Firstly, that's not done by a consultant, that's done by them. So we train the academic partner as well as the local government to work together and to come up with a SIDRA, what we call the SIDRA, in order for them to apply across the different units of the local government, land use planning, environment, social welfare and development. We do have a scorecard. We do have metrics for the progress over the 3 years. And this is really based on the foundation that knowledge co-creation, engagement with multiple stakeholders is the best way to move forward. And in fact, institutionalizing these relationships are the only way to make local communities resilient. And so the Resilient Local Government Unit program is actually our flagship program. We do engage with cities, municipalities, as well as with provinces. And I want to highlight Bataan in particular. Bataan will be familiar with most of us here. Bataan has been really a highlight as far as the milestones towards resilience. It's engaged now in the Transform Year leapfrogging with the Philippine American Academy of Sciences, Science and Engineering. And we've established an advanced science and technology ecosystem in Bataan that is about to begin 3 projects that are all related to resilience to climate and other hazards. So it's a 3-year, 2-track program they must undergo, and the local chief executives and their internal stakeholders, as well as the private sector, CSO, and other community representatives must take part. That's the only way we engage in order to build resilience from the local government up. So I hope that answers the question, Courtney.
Yes, thank you, Tony. And I'm actually going to sort of continue to combine a couple other questions that came in, I think are a good follow-up on that. And this is specifically looking at the challenges that sea level rise poses to the Philippines. So we had one questioner who notes that that's one of the key effects of climate change that's seen particularly in island nations like the Philippines, asking about plans to overcome coastal flooding in the country. And we had another questioner, Eric Lachica from the US Filipinos for Good Governance, who is asking from Tony and Butch as well, 1 or 2 examples of local governments or NGO mitigation efforts against storm surges, which are being made worse by the rise of sea levels. You know, are there national laws being enforced or considered to prevent homes or resorts being built in increasingly vulnerable areas? So that those are a couple sort of broad questions, but I think we'll go first to Butch and then to Tony to sort of comment on the sea level rise and responses to that.
Well, thanks, Courtney. I think that's one of the big challenges. But luckily, there are a number of companies that are involved in planting mangroves as a project to protect these coastal cities from these storm surges that have actually killed people after Super Typhoon Haiyan in the city of Tacloban. Shell launched a mangrove planting program a couple of years ago, and that is very successful. In addition, Metro Pacific Corporation has been talking to us about launching a similar mangrove planting program to protect coastal cities in line with their projects, which they call they're cleaning up beaches. It's called Shore It Up. So there are a number of these programs that are involved today. But yeah, the whole idea is that there are dangers. When I went to Albay after Super Typhoon, yet another Super Typhoon hit the Philippines in November 2020 and visited a coastal community there, everything was gone. And the fishermen had lost their boats and their houses as well. And we're, as just talking about PDRF here, we're active now in terms of replacing some of the boats that were lost after Super Typhoon Odette happened last December, and also working to ensure that these communities hopefully build more resilient housing to withstand future storms.
Tony, did you want to add anything to the comments on sea level rise?
Sure, thank you. A couple of things. The reality is that a lot of the Philippines is basically situated, well, populations are situated in low elevation coastal zones. That is precisely the problem with Tacloban. The entire area that was inundated basically was the urban area, which was within 0 to 5 meters above sea level. And basically most of the coastal cities and metropolitan regions that are with coastal cities that are hubs are within that low elevation coastal zone. So the exposure to sea level rise as a risk is very real all across the Philippines, not just in cities, but in other rural areas as well that are dependent on the fisheries and aquatic resources for their livelihoods. Secondly, urban coastal cities really have a subsidence problem also at hand. So with the unregulated drawing of water from ground wells, subsidence combines with sea level rise. And when that combines with high tides, basically you have a recipe for flooding that is an everyday disaster, not just a seasonal disaster. I do believe at the end of the day that there needs to be a policy formulated for a managed coastal retreat. There needs to be a really strict look at land use management. And at the end of the day, there will need to be a retreat from the coasts. The sooner we recognize that, the faster we will begin to put things in order in terms of building cities that are resilient by design, rather than leaving them to the random migratory and movement of people, and situating them where hazards actually are going to be hitting them relating to sea level rise. So that policy needs to be formulated, especially in coastal cities in the Philippines. Thanks.
Thanks. And I think there's obviously a lot more we could talk about with sea level rise and sort of the challenges that poses. I'm going to shift tracks slightly because we've got a number of questions that have come in about sort of the implementation of these efforts. So I'm gonna talk through some of those questions. So I think this first question is perhaps best addressed to Craig. And it's from Ambassador Bruce Concepcion, who's mentioning that there's a lot of very specific projects that USAID and other development partners have instituted. Many of them are focusing on very important issues such as smart cities or large infrastructure projects. But obviously, all of the assistance that's coming in has to be spread very widely across the archipelago and across the large population of the Philippines. So this question is really, I think, targeting sort of how you prioritize projects and how you target projects, because obviously the impact is felt by specific people in the areas of those projects, particularly urban areas. How can this assistance be inclusive and how considerable, how can it best consider sort of those people in non-urban areas?
Courtney, thanks for passing the ambassador's question along, and I really appreciate that. The first stop is going to be back to the folks on the screen and many others. So the local understanding as to what the drivers are in any given situation is extremely important, and we rely on our significant Philippine staff to be able to help us understand that. And since we've been in the Philippines for 60 years, we have a lot of background there. Let me just mention that, of course, the USAID portfolio in the last 60 years, I think it's around the 5 billion mark at this stage of the game. We're on an annual basis, we have about $100 million portfolio that is focused on many different aspects across the spectrum. And so this is just one aspect that we're drilling down to today, and a very important one, but there are other aspects of the portfolio. And let me pull out one which is extremely relevant to this discussion too, which is COVID, on the COVID response. Because as was mentioned earlier, I think Butch said something about the the fact that the COVID response very much factors into how we approach this as well. The US government has been very proud to be able to provide $4 billion of support to the COVAX advanced market commitment. In Philippines specifically, we're looking at, to date, Philippines has now received more than 53 million vaccine doses, including more than 25 million made available by the American people through COVAX. And then in addition to that, USAID's providing another $3.5 million to get shots in the arms. This is, as we look at, one of the areas of how do we go about figuring out where this goes, what makes sense. The first stop on something like this is definitely going to be the government of the Philippines, who has an overall plan that we need to plug into. And that is the case for COVID, but it's also the case for climate. And it's also the case for health writ large. And it's also the case for private sector engagement. And so we're plugging into those existing plans and working with the government of the Philippines to be able to combine resources. We're also working with other donors and development partners to be able to understand where their focus is so that we have complementarity. We are very much looking at getting inputs, as Tony mentioned earlier, from NGOs and understanding where the needs are from their perspective and where the gaps are, and how we can work together with their considerable resources as well to be able to address the challenge at hand. And then, of course, we have private sector. And I think one of the things, as I mentioned earlier with Southeast Asia, is that it probably at least as much with Southeast Asia as any place in the world, we are very much focused on the fact that private sector brings considerable resources to addressing these range of challenges. And understanding, if you will, the profitability within a development challenge is extremely important if you want to talk about sustainability. And that is exactly where we need to go with a lot of these things, is understanding how we can work together to get a sustainable solution. And so when it comes to any specific issue, we are looking very much for inputs from all of our partners across the board to understand where are their gaps, where would we risk overlap, which we're not interested in doing, where is going to be the correct kind of situation that's going to get us the most beneficial results as well, because we are always focused on the results aspect of things. We have a very robust M&E and learning portfolio that constantly is looking at our projects and saying, are we doing this right? Does this make sense? What about gender? What about youth? What about, and so we're looking at it from a lot of different aspects and having a lot of different input into that process as we develop a 5-year strategy for each of our countries. Thanks.
And Butch, was that a 2-finger?
Well, I did want to say that COVID is a problem, as we've deployed people over Christmas last year. A number of them did get COVID, so it's a complex crisis whenever a storm strikes. But it's especially complex these days because of the dangers of the virus, and it's something we've had to deal with. There in 2020, we actually deployed after the super typhoon then without any vaccination. So this time we were able to deploy people who were vaccinated, but they nevertheless did contract COVID. But we're grateful to US government and many other entities who've been helping the Philippines in this effort. I know a number of private companies are quite active in terms of providing cold storage facilities for the vaccines and helping deploy the vaccines to far-flung areas. So it's a global crisis, much like climate change. So there's a lot of similarities.
Thanks, Butch. And Tony, did you want to jump in with some thoughts before I move to the next question? Oh, looks like you
Yes,
did.
thank you. I just wanted to express our gratitude as well as a nation to the United States for actually making those vaccines available to many of our countrymen. I think moving forward, one of the challenges has really been early detection and surveillance. And I think that this is where there could be grounds for some collaboration in enhancing the capacity of the Philippine government, as well as the different agencies and other members of society, possibly academia as well, in building capacity for early detection surveillance that will produce the kind of warnings and readiness in terms of future pandemics. Thanks.
That's actually a very good segue into sort of the next question, which was directed to Tony, but which I'm going to expand a bit to others on the panel as well. And the question was originally, can you elaborate on the needs for improving early warning systems in the Philippines using technologies like Internet of Things or AI for predictive analysis? And I think the questioner may have been referring more to sort of the immediate weather disasters and events that are striking. But I'm going to actually blow it up a little bit more broadly, because you flag sort of the need for early detection in the health sphere. And our team at the Stimson Center also does a lot of work with the collection of satellite data and other publicly accessible data on infrastructure, on social and environmental and economic impacts and needs of infrastructure. And I think when we're looking at the many issues which are facing the Philippines, whether it's building, humanitarian disaster response capabilities, whether it's building a better knowledge and data set around what's happening with weather, whether it's tracking exactly what's needed on the ground with infrastructure, big data and the internet and new technological advances provide a lot of opportunities and also challenges. So I think, I'll just blow this question up. Can you think a little bit more broadly about what exactly is needed on the ground to utilize these new technologies to their best capacity to help solve these climate challenges? And then I'll also throw, after Tony answers sort of the needs on the capacity side, throw this question over to Craig and Butch to see if they can, from the perspective of a donor or the perspective of the private sector, talk about the way that these big tech advances can really assist with individual projects or with the deployment of US or other assistance.
So you want me to begin answering the question, Panish?
Of course, sorry. So it's a big question. So Tony, if you want to sort of start off with some thoughts on the needs, what's needed on the ground to really build this capacity, then I'll sort of go through other elements of this question to Craig and Butch.
Thank you. So luckily this morning I was in a meeting where Pagasa was there, and I said, listen, what happened to the Doppler radars? How many do you have operating? And they sent me a list, right? So they have 17 operating Dopplers, they say, okay, at this point. The problem, I think, is capacity in terms of radar meteorology. We do need to build capacity within the weather agency to actually process and analyze whatever is coming through from those Dopplers. I doubt that there are enough people in the agency at the moment that can actually handle all the data and process it in time for effective risk communication. And that's actually one of the other needs. We do have technology available, but communicating risk is a different problem altogether. And so early warning systems, while supported by technologies, are useless without risk being communicated where they should be and to whom they should be and at the right time. And that's one of the skills that actually are being developed supposedly by the weather agency at the moment. But really, that should be something that the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council and the Office of Civil Defense, making the last mile the first mile, so that communities that are vulnerable, infrastructure that is vulnerable, actually receive the proper warning early for early action. So that's one issue. In terms of IoT, the big problem, the bear in the room all the time, is really the issue of connectivity in the Philippines, and that sort of infrastructure challenge needs to be addressed by both government and the private sector investing in connectivity. And that's where we have several challenges at the local level, but certainly on the national level. And just as a quick example, small islands, for example, don't have the capability to remain connected whenever large impact events, such as, for example, the last typhoon happened. Why aren't we, in fact, deploying alternative means of communication ahead of time? Why not deploy VSATs ahead of time? Why aren't they part of the redundancies that are available to small islands without the event actually threatening them? That just has to be part of resilience. And so the understanding of resilience as part of redundancy and resourcefulness, robustness of infrastructure, that needed more by the end users as well as the investors at the end of the day. I'd like to speak a little bit about AI and the use of this kind of predictive technologies in humanitarian action. My big take there is that while AI and machine learning are actually great as far as, in fact, the new tools that can be deployed in terms of trying to look at what could be done ahead of time, what could be prepared ahead of time, the human dimension in terms of making use and the discretion in terms of the outputs of these types of predictive technologies is equally important. And so context as well as data remain critical. Context must be provided in order for the data to actually become effective in terms of interventions on the ground. And I guess I'll end there because I know other partners might wish to respond. But let me say this last bit. The Manila Observatory, on which I serve also as a board trustee, has actually now taken over around 200 automated weather stations from a private foundation that once actually run them to provide weather analysis for the country as part of a research project that it actually is undertaken, funded by the private sector. And so aside from the government agency that actually produces this weather analysis and climate research, we do have an institutional capacity in academia and in the research community to actually make use of the data. And we do have the instruments to actually collect the data. Connectivity is a challenge. It remains a challenge, and that's what we have to be assured of. But certainly at this point, that data is being used to provide warnings for severe weather situations to partners, as well as, of course, to analyze potential renewable energy hotspots for the country, for example, for clean energy use. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I think that was a really helpful overview of some of the needs and challenges that exist in this space. I'm going to turn very briefly to Craig. I know that USAID has done a lot with sort of data analysis and tools and capacity building in this space. They've supported some of the programming that our team's done on infrastructure data in the Mekong region. So I'm just curious, Craig, if you can sort of respond to some of those needs that Tony just highlighted and flag where you see opportunities or potential opportunities for the United States or other development partners to assist in meeting some of these needs.
Courtney, thank you for the question and appreciate Tony's summary on that one as well. It's such a massive effort, right, globally, to try to get the right technology applied correctly with the new challenges or the old challenges. And so I think that when it comes to a global approach, one of the things that USAID has done a very good job of doing is inviting others to come up with solutions, challenging the grand challenges that have been out there for a while now. Bringing these grand challenges to the forefront to say, here are the issues that we see. Here's one way to define this issue. What are the potential solutions that we have when it comes to applying a range of new or not so new technologies to address this? Because reaching out to others and making sure that we have an inclusive process of seeking the best ideas for the most challenging issues, it has got to be part of the solution set. And so that's one of the things that we've been trying to do for a while now is open that door to be more inclusive, to understand where the linkages can be, to figure out where the application of the latest cutting edge technologies can apply to a specific situation. And as we talked about earlier, do so sustainably. And so I think we need everyone's ideas coming to the forefront on this. Let me address one piece of the question as well, which was the early warning capacity aspect. So one of the areas that we're working on, and not surprisingly with universities, again, going to that line of understanding how we can partner with different entities to bring their solutions, the right solutions to the table. So enhancing ASEAN early warning capacity has been one of our areas of focus. USAID, our Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, has supported the Pacific Disaster Center, which is managed out of the University of Hawaii, to continue to develop and enhance compatibility of early warning systems and hazard monitoring systems for ASEAN nations. And so the program's bolstered the capacity of national disaster management agencies to assess the automated hazard information and infrastructure data and to be able to, importantly, this is critical, share that information and strengthen warning systems, because the sharing of information becomes critical in this space, of course. It's also strengthened in terms of the early warning capabilities and hazard monitoring for the ASEAN Coordination Center for Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Management. That's a mouthful, the AHA Center out of ASEAN, in terms of working with ASEAN partners and countries to be able to look at it from an intergovernmental organizational approach that coordinates emergency response among the different ASEAN nations in terms of humanitarian organizations, the UN and others. The disaster monitoring and response system has also included the training of ASEAN member state agencies and in terms of the DMRS use. And so we're talking about software, we're talking about all of those pieces that have come together in a range of situations to be able to provide that early warning system. And so that's one of the areas where we're working with the university to be able to come together. I know it has a private sector component as well, because as Butch has mentioned a couple of times, private sector has to have this information as well from the economic standpoint of things. And so there's a lot of connectivity there. So maybe I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, Courtney, let me add something to what Craig said and Tony said. But you're right, Craig, the climate resilient cities projects does have an early detection aspect to it for local government units. So that's one thing. And then Tony, in terms of connectivity, we actually had to provide connectivity to one of the Doppler radar stations of Pagasa in Bohol, so that this has already been built. It just wasn't transmitting any data because they had no connectivity. So we helped them out there. But in terms of early detection, let me just present a quick study, because the last typhoon, Super Typhoon Ray, which hit over December, our operations center at Clark was able to track it when it first started forming on December 8th in Micronesia. At the time, it was just a tropical depression, but we could see it increasing. And on around December 13 and December 14, it really jumped, as I mentioned to some of you earlier, from what was at the time just a Category 1 storm, and a lot of people, really most people thought it was just going to be another storm, all the way to a Category 5 super typhoon within 24 hours. And we were able to track it through our operations center, and that's why we were able to prepare people for it, a lot of communities and businesses, and we were able to respond quickly within a few days. We were able to deploy a team to Southern Leyte, another team to Cebu, and I joined the team, went to Surigao City. All this within a few days, because we could see the storm as it developed from its beginning within that 4-week period that we were tracking it. So I think that's a good example of early detection. We're also installing, with an Israeli company, something called Seismic Ai. These are early earthquake warning devices in the province of Batangas. So that gives you a few seconds early warning. We're going to test it out. If it works, we'll try and deploy it in other provinces as well.
All right, thank you, Butch. I know we're going slightly over time now, so I don't want to keep everyone on longer than we promised. So we do have a number of questions that we haven't had a chance to get to yet. I will share all of those with the panelists, and I think it's clear that climate change is a topic that's evergreen, and hope that we'll have a chance to return to this conversation in the future, since there's still a lot to discuss. So with that, hey,
sorry,
Tony, did you want to jump in with a quick?
Very, very quick one. Just regionally, and this is really on the science and technology collaboration side in the US and the Philippines, there has been a mission called the Campex Mission, and we're now actually on Campex, the third really incarnation of Campex. Campex basically was looking at cloud aerosols and in the Southeast Asian region and how that will affect climate and weather. And now it's looking at air quality as well. So that's a collaboration between NASA and the Manila Observatory under the US-Philippine Science and Technology Agreement. And so I just wanted to raise that because that has implications in terms of climate research and eventually some applications. So this is basic research. Secondly, There is a project that is ongoing between George Mason University and the Ateneo de Manila University on agent-based modeling for the evacuation of megacities. And that's a collaboration that we initiated, the National Resilience Council, because of our program in the city of Manila. And so these are ongoing examples of initiatives that not necessarily have gone through national government, but actually are going now bilaterally between academic institutions, research organizations, and universities and NASA on the US side. Thanks.
Thanks, Tony. So with that, and I'll just note, I think there's ample space for us to continue this conversation in the future, and I'll turn things over to Hank for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Courtney and Stimson, Brian Eiler. Thank you, Bill Wise and Courtney, for your masterful orchestration of today's program. The partnership with the Southeast Asia Forum is important for the Philippines, and we can see why from today's discussion. Let me commend Ambassador Ramaldas for his comments on explaining Philippine climate diplomacy, and particularly his emphasis on the shared responsibility that the international community bears in response to this. His team is terrific in addressing this, along with many other programs. And we note that Ambassador said he'll be traveling back to the Philippines, and we look forward, those of us who go back and forth and had in the past, we look forward to doing that again now, conditions permitting. Let me also commend Tony and Butch. I think their presentations reflect just how good the leadership in the Philippines is on climate change, and not just in responding, but also in planning and in terms of laying out the policy implications of what the work they're doing here. For example, Tony's comment about what needs to be done with respect to sea level rises, clear policy implications there for the incumbent as well as the next government coming in after the elections. So thank you, Butch and Tony, for that. Craig's remarks were right on the mark as well. USAID has done a terrific job. Craig laid out what's been done, but more than that, he talked about the US-Philippine partnership and how we're engaged in forward planning as an example with the Climate Resilient Cities Initiative. So thank you very much, Craig, for taking time to join us today to explain that. It's really important. At a broader policy and practical level, the bilateral strategic dialogue vision statement that's both Ambassador Ramaldas and Craig referred to was issued last November, reflects this shared commitment to address climate change. And that's an evolution in sort of the way the strategic partnership between the Philippines and the United States has evolved. It was defense, it was foreign policy and strategic issues, but now the climate, along with the pandemic and economic issues are all brought into the strategic partnership. It shows that people at a policy level are thinking about the importance of the climate change challenges and how we can respond. And as well, the administration's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was issued last year and is being talked about a little bit now, a little bit more, calls for support for investments in resilience building, and that's a very positive step. Finally, let me join in extending condolences to the Romulov family. Bobby Romulo was not just a founding director of the U.S.-Philippine Society, but along with Ambassador Tom Hubbard, a founding father. And in his work, it was important in so many areas, including his leadership in climate, but his vision for U.S.-Philippine society is something that we hope to be able to carry forward. And with programs like that, I think Bobby would see some of the value and the vision he had more than 10 years ago. So thank you. And thank you all.
Good. Thank you, Hank. And thanks to our other co-sponsor, the Southeast Asia League of Students at Johns Hopkins SAIS. We'll be co-sponsoring a program with the SAIS SEALs on Friday, February 18 on Indonesia and COP26. And in March and April, we plan programs on political prisoners in Southeast Asia, a critique of the Biden administration's policy towards the region, U.S.-Vietnam relations, the conflict in Myanmar, and perhaps others as well. Ambassador Ramaldas, would you like to make a final comment?
Well, thank you, Bill. No, I just want to thank once again your panelists, Butch, Tony, and Craig, for a very fruitful discussion today on climate change. And I can't express how grateful we are, especially to the USAID, whenever there is a big disaster that happens in the Philippines. They're always there, and we appreciate that very much. And we certainly look forward to continuing our relationship with the United States and working together in mitigating climate change. So thank you to all your panelists, and thank you to you, Bill, and to Hank for organizing this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thanks from all of us to our very distinguished panel. You bring different perspectives united by your great expertise and your strong professional concern for this important subject. To all of our audience, thank you for joining us. We were delighted to have you with us. We're sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but as Courtney said, the questions will go to the speakers, and perhaps one day you will find in your inbox a response to a question that we weren't able to get into this conversation originally. So on behalf of all of us, stay safe and well. And until next time, this is the Philippines Roundtable at the Southeast Asia Forum. Thanks for your participation and